Horace Walpole was born in 1717 with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth, the youngest son of the all-powerful Sir Robert Walpole, 1st Earl of Orford and effectively Britain's first Prime Minister. At 21, Walpole was given government sinecures, producing some £2,000 a year. At the time, a skilled tradesman received about £35 a year, and at 24, he was given a seat in Parliament, freeing him from the need to earn a living. Undistracted by the responsibilities of high government office, a great estate, or a family, he never married. He was able to devote his life to politics, writing, scholarship, obsessive collecting, and the creation of his pioneering Gothic summer villa, Strawberry Hill. This painting of his parents in a 17th century frame, showing them in front of Houghton Hall, was commissioned by Walpole for Strawberry Hill. As a younger son, Walpole never expected to inherit his father's great Palladian house in Norfolk, although to his shock he eventually did. So he needed a place for the summer when smart people always left town, and that was Strawberry Hill. Next, please. Walpole was a complex character. In public, he was a man of taste, at the centre of politics and fashion, valued for his lively wit and company. But in private, he was a hard-working scholar, historian, and writer. His vivid record of these different worlds, in some 4,000 letters, has been a main resource for historians ever since. That is exactly what he wished, for he saw the present as history in the making, although he came to prefer what he regarded as the certainties of the past, writing in 1766, quote, "I almost think there's no wisdom comparable to that of exchanging what is the realities of life for dreams. Old castles, old pictures, old histories, and the babble of old people make one live back into centuries that cannot disappoint one." Or as he put it elsewhere, quote, "I pass all my mornings in the 13th century and all my evenings with the century that is coming on." The Reynolds portrait on the right shows him as the gentleman author with a print of his famous Roman eagle, which he acquired from Rome in the 1740s. Next, please. Significantly, the only portrait of Horace Walpole as an adult on view at Strawberry Hill in his time showed him in time-travelling fancy dress, borrowed from a picture by Van Dyck. This is the painting on the right. He's holding his catalogue of his father's pictures at Houghton, with Strawberry Hill in the background. On the left is the only picture to show him at home in Strawberry Hill. He is in modern dress, seated in his library, the centre of his scholarly and creative endeavours, as well as the setting for part of his huge collection of art and artefacts. For all the carefully recorded scholarly apparatus that surrounds him here, he's shown at his gentlemanly ease and without a pen in hand. Does the open book on the floor signify the dilettante, or does it signify the busy checker of facts? We cannot know, but the first seems more likely, for Walpole, like his creation Strawberry Hill, was always at pains to conceal his seriousness beneath a carefully casual mask. Built between 1749 and 1790, Strawberry Hill was created, wrote Walpole, quote, "to please my own taste and in some degree to realise my own visions." In 1753, he described it as the castle I am building of my ancestors. Pinnacled and battlemented, it gave the impression of having developed over centuries, pioneered design ideas that led directly to the Gothic revival of the next century. For Walpole, the Gothic, crucially, had a unique ability to summon up ideas and emotions, turning Strawberry Hill above all into a place of the imagination, and one full of stories. Next, please. It was this setting that inspired Walpole to write in 1764 The Castle of Otranto, the earliest Gothic novel, following a dream he had at Strawberry Hill. Quote, "Of which all I could recover was that I had thought myself in an ancient castle, a very natural dream for a head like mine, for a head filled like mine with Gothic story, and that on the uppermost banister of a great staircase I saw a gigantic hand in armour. That banister was just outside his bedchamber at Strawberry Hill." The story has many references to the house, and one, it seems, even to Pope's Grotto. Next, please. Strawberry Hill was very largely designed by a small, intimate group of amateurs, the Strawberry Committee. This is often described in the literature as the Committee of Taste. That is a 20th century invention, so we shouldn't be using it. The committee was firmly led by Walpole, who sketched out his ideas. Here for the library ceiling in the top left hand of the slide. The exteriors and much else were designed by his friend John Shute, whose drawing is on the top right, and the interiors and details by the artist Richard Bentley, whose library design is at the bottom right. This library design was much too fanciful for Walpole, who was working to pioneer direct copies from medieval buildings in his activities at Strawberry Hill. Ever keen to spread the Gothic gospel, the committee also designed buildings for others, including a priory of St. Hubert at Marble Hill for Walpole's great friend Henrietta Howard. Next, please. Walpole was delighted to find in 1747 the last bit of developable riverside land in the fashionable, cultural and artistic parish of Twickenham. He wrote, quote, "Dowagers as plenty as flounders inhabit all around, and Pope's ghost is just now skimming under my window by a most poetical moonlight. Richmond Hill and Ham Walks bound my prospect, but thank God the Thames is between me and the Duchess of Queensberry." By 1754, he had finished the first stage of his villa, set in a landscape garden that optimized the view towards Twickenham, as you can see in this marvelous painting. Next, please. A newly discovered view of the house at this early stage shows how it was square and almost symmetrical, and that point attached to a pre-existing building. In fact, the Gothic villa itself was cleverly formed around a rather ungainly group of older structures, which Walpole described rather poetically when he first acquired it as the prettiest bauble you ever saw. That is because it belonged to Mrs. Chevenix, who was in fact a toy woman who sold knickknacks and things, including jewelry. Next, please. In 1760, Walpole built out a new, long, asymmetrical wing with a tower. Now, we know how important symmetry was in the 18th century. We know from Marble Hill. To make something asymmetrical was very daring. And this suddenly made the house romantic and medieval, and a pioneer, a true pioneer in the story of the Gothic revival. Walpole had a funny story about this, which he might have invented. Yes, which he might have invented, but it's a good story anyway. In one of his commonplace books, he writes, "A year before the gallery was built, a stranger passing asked an old farmer belonging to Mr. Walpole, that is one of his tenants, if Strawberry Hill was not an old house. He replied, yes, and Mr. Walpole designs to build one much older next year." So that's clearly the long wing. Next, please. Inside the house, the ancestral message was reinforced with many family coats of arms, especially on the painted library ceiling, as we've seen designed by Walpole. but also included crusading medieval forebears on horseback. The armorials focused on the ancestry of Sir Robert Walpole, whose somewhat tarnished posthumous reputation Walpole worked hard to repair. Next, please. The room names too recalled medieval buildings and ancient country houses, including his dining room, which was variously called the refectory, as in a monastery. Walpole sometimes signed himself in his letters as the Abbot of Strawberry, or the Great Parlour, as in an ancient country house. The drawing here is one, and others that you will see, is one of the systematic records Walpole had made of the appearance of his house, mainly held now by the Lewis Walpole Library. The modern photograph, and others you will see, was taken in 2018 during the Lost Treasures of Strawberry Hill exhibition, when many of Walpole's masterpieces were temporarily returned to their original places. Next, please. Requests, but Strawberry Hill was much more than a private retreat. It was also a place for elaborate parties, and for the many visitors who came on tours, 4 people a day, no children, please, on most days in the season. These 2 requests for tours are from William Roffey, a prosperous distiller, we must presume, of gin in Kingston, and from Mrs. Elizabeth Twining Twickenham, who managed the famous Twinings Tea and Coffee Merchants. Her little card reads, Mrs. Twining presents her compliments to Mr. Walpole. She has got some company with her that will be extremely obliged to let them see his house any time this morning, Saturday, August the 28th. Walpole's reaction to this rather sudden request is not recorded. Both requests have fallen down behind Walpole's living room mantelpiece, together with 13 other cards left by visitors or inviting Walpole to dine with various local aristocrats. Next, please. What drew most visitors to Strawberry Hill were the interiors and the collections that filled it. By the time of Walpole's death in 1797, Strawberry Hill contained at least 4,000 objects, not counting several thousand prints, drawings, and coins acquired over some 55 years. It included paintings and sculpture, classical antiquities, historical curiosities, and a wide range of decorative arts, carefully assembled thematically to tell particular stories, as in an ancient house developed over time. Walpole used both objects and architecture to spark the imagination and open doorways to the past. In 1769, he actually wore part of his collection at an elaborate party, quotes, for all of France, and in it became a true time traveler. This is Walpole writing. They arrived too at the gates of the castle. I received them dressed in the cravat of Gibbons's carving, and a pair of gloves embroidered up to the elbows that had belonged to James I. The French servants stared and firmly believed this was the dress of English country gentlemen. Next, please. Objects of royal provenance were particularly important to Walpole, especially those associated with the Tudors and their predecessors. They included a clock reputedly given by Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. It is a genuine clock of Henry VIII. And a portrait of the family of Henry VII, probably once in Richmond Palace. This is a replica which the Strawberry Hill Trust has made to hang on the staircase. Next, please. And the date range of his collection was huge, from the ancient Roman eagle to modern Wedgwood designed for him by one of his female artistic proteges, Lady Diana Beauclerk, who lived for a time at Little Marble Hill. But the most prominent works on show were pictures, and most of those were portraits. Walpole was a keen connoisseur of painting and the first historian of British art, publishing his anecdotes of painting at his own press at Strawberry Hill from 1762. Strawberry Hill, a house full of portraits of notable people, became a house full of stories, presenting distinctive aspects of British and European history and in a pioneering and museum-like way. When the house was filled again with the paintings in 2018-19 for the exhibition, the effect was truly remarkable and also unexpected, because suddenly it was a house full of people, like real people. And you could imagine Walpole on his own wandering among these historical and also contemporary figures, meeting them all as people and knowing all their stories. Next, please. Walpole, but most, I think we're on this. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Walpole invented the word gloom to describe, quote, the irregular lightness and solemnity of Gothic. In the interiors at Strawberry Hill, he enhanced this effect by an extremely sophisticated manipulation of atmosphere and mood, writing in 1772 that, quote, great effects may be produced by the disposition of a house and by studying lights and shades and by attending to a harmony of colours. I have practiced all these rules in my house at Strawberry Hill and have observed the impressions made on spectators by these arts. This is a truly remarkable document in the history of taste and the history of decorating. I think there is no comparison, there is no parallel anywhere in this sort of looking at how people, recording how people react to his decorative schemes. The accurate restoration of Strawberry Hill has meant visitors can once again enjoy this mood journey of dark and light episodes. It starts in the Great Hall with, quote, the conventual retirement of the entrance. Walpole believed that the inner hall was like a part of a convent and leads to the greater light of the staircase. The greater light, of course, turns the staircase into something that is like the courtyard of a castle and worth remembering when you think of the Castle of Otranto. Next, please. The stairs lead to the private rooms which surround it and is where Walpole led most of his daily life. He didn't live in the state apartment, which we will see shortly. So these were his private rooms. They are all cheerful and light-filled and all have up-to-date what would then be conceived as modern wallpapers. The most expensive wallpaper was this flock in Walpole's own bedchamber. This, of course, is the room in which he had the dream that inspired the Castle of Otranto. You might think that this might inspire bad dreams in anybody. It is an extraordinary performance of a flock imitating a cut velvet and was very, very expensive. Next, please. The next stage, wrote Walpole, was a darker episode. Quote, the Star Chamber and Dusky Passage again prepare you for solemnity. The Holbein Chamber softens that idea, yet still maintains a grave tone, for the whole colouring is a kind of chiaroscuro. The painted glass darkens part of the windows and heightens the landscapes to which they look. Walpole greatly valued the interesting contrast, an enlivening contrast between the gloom of the interiors and the cheerful, what he called the rayon of nature outside, because for him, the outside and the inside were equal value. If you go to Strawberry Hill, you will see that the windows in parts of the house actually slide sideways, disappearing into the walls. That means that when you looked out of the windows, it was as if you were looking at a landscape. You saw the landscape outside essentially as a painting, and all those people in the boats and the coaches and on the horses on the roads were like the staffage, like the people in the painted landscape. The Holbein Chamber was a pioneering room in terms of English architecture. It was the first room in British architecture that was actively trying to look like a room from the past. The ceiling was borrowed from a ceiling in now disappeared at Windsor Castle, and the screen from a screen in Rouen Cathedral. He was trying to create what he conceived as a true historical room, and it was absolutely pioneering. Next, please. Between the Holbein Chamber and the gallery was what he called the Dusky Passage. It's otherwise called the Trunk Sealed Passage. It's a very effective space. And the whole point of it was to make it darker before you got into the blaze of the gallery. Walpole writes, "The Dusky Passage makes the richness and largeness of the gallery appear much more considerable." And that is true, even true today, even though Lady Walgrave, one of the later inhabitants of Strawberry, lengthened the Dusky Passage and removed the stained glass window you can see in the Carter drawing on the left. The Holbein Chamber is on the right. Next, please. The visitor and we then reach the blaze of light and crimson in the gallery and the other rooms of the state apartment. These were built for his art collection and for entertainment. Walpole was quite frank about this. He said that he had to expand in order to house his collection, mostly of very big paintings. And you can see that in the photograph on the right, taken in the exhibition, with those enormous Jacobean portraits hanging between the windows. And he had to make it higher in order to put paintings above the Jacobean portraits, which we didn't put into the exhibition. The effect of the gallery was its extraordinary ceiling, based on the side aisle of Henry VII's chapel, and carried out in plaster and all the detail in papier-mâché. The effect seems to have taken even Walpole by surprise, because he wrote about the new gallery, "I begin to be ashamed of my own magnificence." Next, please. Off the gallery is a room that he called the chapel, first of all, and he called it the closet. And then he called it the tribune, after the tribuna in the Uffizi in Florence, which is the room which contains the great Medici treasures. And of course, this is the room in which Walpole concentrated his treasures. You can see it in this wonderful drawing by John Carter on the left. The walls absolutely covered in tiny pictures, bronzes on the shelves, and the Walpole cabinet for miniatures on the straight ahead of you in the drawing, which is now in the V&A, and on the right in the photograph of the room during our wonderful exhibition. Walpole said about when he was thinking about this room, that it was supposed to have all the air of a Catholic chapel bar consecration, and it certainly succeeded in that. And he writes about it in this account of the atmospheres of Strawberry. "The chapel has the true air of a place of devotion, and that impression makes it please those seen after so much larger spaces." Next, please. And finally, we come to the Great North Bedchamber. This was the last room that Walpole made, and it was, you reach it through a little passage which given that it's sort of rather jammed into the structure of the building, a little passage near the tribune. And he tries to write this away in his document, because he says, and finally we come to the Great North Bedchamber, quote, the sobriety of the chapel and the idea of having seen all the house, because you don't expect to see this, makes the opening of the Great Bedchamber the more surprising from its not being expected, and from the striking contrast between the awe impressed by the chapel and the gush of light and gaudiness and grandeur of the bedchamber. And this is an effect that you can still get when you go into these rooms, especially the Great North Bedchamber, which is the only room which is hung with silk textiles on the walls. In 1774 and 1784, Walpole published from his own press, next slide, please. Thank you. In 1774 and 1784, Walpole published from his own press a description of Strawberry Hill, the later edition with illustrations, a blow-by-blow account of every room and every single object within it. It may have been begun as an aid to a housekeeper guide for visitors, but its real purpose was to transmit Walpole's reputation to posterity as a great collector and builder. For he believed, almost from the start, childless as he was, that Strawberry Hill would not survive, quotes, 10 years after I am dead. In 1842, the collection was dispersed in a celebrated 24-day sale, one of the great sales of the 19th century. Walpole was wrong about the survival of its reputation, for Strawberry Hill has been accurately restored to its appearance in 1797, with its garden too. And the Strawberry Hill Trust and the Strawberry Hill Collection Trust are working to bring back his collection, some 60 objects so far, or make replicas of them. We like to think at Strawberry Hill that Walpole will be thrilled to see it, and I hope that our visitors will be too. Thank you.